Okay, so I'm probably a little bit different in terms of looking at urban areas. I've been looking at urban biodiversity since about too long, probably since the late 90s, and originally with Botanic Gardens and now with the university. And one of the things that the reasons why I do work in urban areas is because it is really where the majority of Australians, being a highly urbanised country, one of the most urbanised countries in the world, where the majority of the Australians are getting their connections to nature. So if we can get our Indigenous biodiversity back into our cities, hopefully those connections will be greater and there'll be greater support for biodiversity throughout the country in those areas where we've been talking about in terms of reintroductions of fauna and other things today. So there's been an increasing body of research suggesting that cities are really important for urban biodiversity. They are sometimes rare and threatened species, such as the Frankston spider orchid we talked about before, only occur in cities. And cities can be really important for the biodiversity of their regions as well. So they're not biological deserts. They're not concrete jungles either. They can support a significant amount of remnant biodiversity, but what we also need to think about is how we can get Indigenous species back into our urban landscapes, into our designed urban landscapes, to supplement what's happening or what is able to persist, hopefully, in the remnant vegetation. Most cities and local government areas really want to conserve biodiversity. They've signed global agreements and on board for the Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a number of global compacts which a lot of Australian cities and LGAs are following. And many have biodiversity strategies and action plans, and that's just not capital cities or metropolitan LGAs. Greater Bendigo has that as well. So one of the things that my group is interested in doing, have been doing for a long time, is to work with local governments to provide the evidence base to enable successful introductions and using native species in urban areas. Because it's not just, we've got to change business as usual, and having the evidence for that is important. So when we look for the opportunities to restore urban biodiversity, we've got those remnant vegetation, which we need to protect and enhance, but where are the other spaces? And in urban landscapes, thinking about the public spaces is important, and there's some work that PhD student of mine, Adrian Marshall, who now works for the VMPA, has done, where he sort of classified the land use in Melbourne, and was quantifying how much of the land use was actually taken up by roads and road easements. And so when we looked at overall, almost 30% was residential gardens, so private spaces. Public green space was 12%, but 7% of the overall land use was road easements. Not the roads, the road easements. And then when you think about it that way, almost 37% of public open space is road easements. So that's nature strips, which is often an oxymoron, the roundabouts, the rights of way, where there's potentially opportunities to do lots of work around biodiversity. Maybe not on our big major roads, we are concerned about them being ecological sinks potentially, but in an urban landscape, the lower traffic roads are something we can think about. And 7% compares with pretty similar numbers in other studies around the world. There's not too many which have quantified these areas. So we argue that we should be thinking on public open space, and that's because we don't have to coordinate huge numbers of individuals. There are arguments in the literature about using private gardens for biodiversity conservation, but that means convincing a whole lot of individuals that you need to do gardens for wildlife, and everyone's gardens are different. The urban landscapes are incredibly heterogeneous. So it's very difficult to be able to do that and very time consuming. By all means, I think get that message out there and try and convert people to using more native plants. But in terms of bang for the buck, getting local government on board is pretty important, I'd argue. There's more dollars available potentially. We can really think about connectivity. And by doing work on public land, you're overcoming some of those environmental justice issues that are particularly prevalent in other parts of the world. So if we want to conserve and restore urban biodiversity, the first thing to do is to stop destroying remnant vegetation. And I've had a bit to say about the Melbourne Strategic Assessment and other things in the past, but that's the first step. We can manage that remnant vegetation better. But then let's think about our urban green spaces and improving the habitat quality of our existing urban green spaces. So these are species-specific probabilities of occurrence for a whole lot of species we surveyed in urban green spaces in Melbourne as part of a big project in southeastern Melbourne. So we've got bats up the top here. So each one of these lines is the probability of occurrence of a particular bat species. And likewise for native birds, introduced birds, native bees, bugs, as in the genus, family, sorry, and beetles. And so one of the drivers of this, or one of the, I think the big takeaway lessons from this research was that as we increase the amount of understory volume, the probability of occurrence of most of the taxa goes up. So increasing vegetation complexity is really good for the native biodiversity in particular. So we've got increasing lines here. And interesting also, the proportion of native vegetation in the areas that we were surveying is a strong driver as well. So greater native vegetation, greater amounts of native animals, in particular the invertebrates, and then the birds and the bats respond to the numbers and abundance of invertebrates in the system. So when you think about retaining those native trees, because they're also important when we look at these things, not so much for the bugs, because these are mainly hang around the long grass, increase the understory volume and complexity, and really try and increase the proportion of native vegetation in the landscape. So that means in our urban landscapes, specifying native species as much as possible. And we've done other research which shows that the number of butterfly species really drops off once you get above about 30% impervious surfaceness. So a lot of these species are tied to the invertebrates are tied to their plant hosts, as we've heard already today. Further examples of this is some work by Monique Burns, who was an honours student with us a couple of years ago. She surveyed 32 sites across Melbourne, and half of them were basically Indigenous plantings, Indigenous meadows, and half were exotic plantings. So sort of revegetation areas versus what's in the Treasury Gardens is probably a good way to think about it. And these were a mixture of sort of park and in the urban matrix. And this is a network diagram that she was able to put together from her analyses, which shows that there's... so native bees are on the right, and the plants that they were captured foraging on are on the left, with exotic plants in blue and indigenous plants in orange and native ones in green. And so the width of the bar indicates the number of interactions that we've got going on here. And so there's some species here which are really good for native bees. So Wallenbergia is a fantastic plant for native bees, and so we had 17 different native bee species foraging on Wallenbergia capillaris. So, so we're, again, further evidence that planting the native plant species is really good for native bees. And in contrast, the exotic species have got relatively few native bee pollinators, and they are generalists. So the native bees tend to interact with more with native indigenous plants and the greater variety of resources. So municipal governments control large areas of land, there's lots of passionate staff working with them, and they've got relatively large budgets. So it's good to try and convince them that we want to bring them on board for the biodiversity journey. And however, to change business as usual, we need evidence to do that. So what we've got is an urban ecology research partnership with the City of Melbourne, and that I'm going to talk about a few of the projects today that we've worked with. And that's sort of biodiverse road verges and native wildflower meadows. So biodiverse road verges was established. Initially they came to us asking for a plant palette which they could specify for urban designers and landscape architects. You know, what's going to grow well in the really tough environment that occurs on streets. There wasn't a huge amount of horticultural information around the tolerance of these species. But what we selected them on was for their horticultural attributes, but also the biodiversity resources that we had evidence for them providing for, and so the target species. The target species were bees, butterflies and birds. A bunch of horticultural attributes, so normal sort of planting design attributes, but also the biodiversity resources that they're providing. And this is an example of, so that's all on the City of Melbourne website, and it's not just applicable to the City of Melbourne, so the Urban Nature Planting Guide, and you can filter this based on various attributes. But what was really great is that we then said, well, how do we know this works? And the City of Melbourne were very keen to help us test that. So we did a before-after control impact experiment at 4 sites within the City of Melbourne, which were part of their normal streetscape upgrade program. And so we turned them from traditional lawn to a biodiverse planting. And we also had 3 control sites for each of these impact sites. Before surveys in March 2017 and November, and then after surveys for 5 years. So a good set of data. Bees and butterflies were surveyed in a pretty standard way with plots and random walks, and birds with a 20-minute time count. And then a bunch of analyses were done. So over those 4 years, we found lots and lots of bees from 25 species, 2 exotic, 23 native. Butterflies, only 7 species. So as I mentioned before, urbanisation really impacts butterflies. And birds, but they're all pretty boring urban birds. But what was great is that with the bees, there was a sustained increase in native bee abundance and a significant difference between the impact and controls pretty quickly. And the richness was also high. I've got to get faster. The abundance of the bees, the butterflies, they increased, but the richness didn't due to that impervious surfaceness. So there wasn't a difference in the richness. And as I said before, the birds were pretty boring. No difference between control and impact sites. And that's probably a landscape scale thing, more than just streets. So this plant pallet's been rolled out in a number of places, which is great to see. What I really want to talk about too is these direct-seeded meadows that we're working with, and shout out to Catherine in the audience, who's a PhD student who's sort of driving this. This was initiated by City of Melbourne coming to us and saying, well, why isn't the grassland circle in Royal Park native grassland? They've tried lots of times and spent lots of money trying to make it native grassland, and it wasn't. Given it was former sports fields with high nutrient values, it wasn't surprising for those of you who know grassland ecology. Catherine did a little bit of a small-scale experiment and found that sand with capping was the most promising technique. We get some germination of the seed which actually grew in those sites. And then went on to a larger proof of concept trial in an area along Gatehouse Street which was previously mulched. So underneath red gums predominantly, and she set up 54 trial plots. You should be giving this talk. And direct seeded with 24 species and 5 grass species. We grew the Forbes species ourselves at Burnley and bought the grass species. This was done during COVID. It was within her 5-kilometre range in Melbourne, which you people in Bendigo didn't have to worry about as much. And monitored plant cover richness and weed biomass and how long it took to do the maintenance on these sites. Data collection went for 18 months. There's the plots. Probably don't need to really need monitoring to see the difference. And had a whole lot of species established, of which a few of those are rare and threatened. So we're reintroducing rewilding, if you wish, to Parkville and Royal Park more generally. So there's lots of benefits of this. We're putting species from a critically endangered ecosystem back into an urban landscape. The urban landscapes are actually really useful to do this. They have the money and resources. They have water, which makes it easier. They've got lots of people who can appreciate this. The amount of Instagram is interesting. They're pretty drought resilient and they're beautiful landscapes which will impress people and get people interested in these things, as well as providing, as Monique has demonstrated, lots of resources for birds and butterflies. And they're also an important act of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And with that, we've actually had this area burnt by the Wurundjeri last Easter. It's the first burn that they've done in the city of Melbourne in 200 odd years. Because this is done on sand, the grassland's been direct seeded onto sand, we're not sure how that will work in a burning context, and so we're going to be monitoring that. We're doing some surveys in the next couple of months. And because of the success of these projects, everyone wants a meadow. They're now in Oak Street, and we've done a more artistic design one in Dodd Street in South Bank, which is just starting to germinate, again on soils that we brought in. We've recently received a big grant to try and do this, bring in the circular economy using recycled construction soils and subsoils to do that, and that's with 6 local councils, so every one of them gets a 0.25 hectare meadow as part of the deal. And we've also been working with the City of Bayside in Yallockit-Willam Nature Reserve as well, and that's been recently direct seeded too. So and that meadow's been is germinating at the moment too. So we're putting wildflowers back into the landscape in a number of spots. It's a bit restricted by seed supply, and hopefully we can train up the Wurundjeri and others to be able to grow the seed for these in the future. But really thinking about the learnings, it does require champions from the city local governments. Need to be able to accept failure. We try and minimise that, but some things it doesn't work. And these carry risks initially, but we're overcoming and the research is working through those risks, and then hopefully making it business as usual, so we don't just have to mow the grass. We can have wildflower meadows in our areas. You've got to supervise contractors to stop them planting plants in pots. And maintenance. Got to think about the maintenance aspects of it. Really need to design for that, and work through that. So thank you very much. The communication is also key. Thank you. Sorry, let's rush through the last ones there, but come and talk to Catherine or I if you.
Well, we might do some questions if you have time.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm come back to some of those slides, maybe. Yeah.
I'm from Melbourne, and you've definitely inspired me to make my non-nature strip into a wildflower meadow, so I can update my little patch. We do have some time for some questions. If anyone wants to kick us off, put your hand up.
Thanks, Nick. City of Melbourne's awesome like that. The program's going. But what do you do if you're a middle belt eastern suburbs? About 25 years ago, I wanted to put a wildflower meadow on my verge, and I was told that was not possible, or I could plant this grass. Being neurodiverse, I knew that they meant Laura's pucus, but since they just said grass, I have a lovely nature strip of Demeter, Stiper, Erythrosta, etc. What do you do to change these archaic views of local governments?
Hi Sue, good to see you. Not all local governments have archaic views. I'd argue that's changed a lot. We work with a lot of progressive local governments, and they've all got biodiversity officers who are very interested in doing this. Saying that, sometimes it's just good to ignore them when you're dealing with your nature strip. I did, and I burned my nature strip. The neighbours think I'm a bit strange, but the council hasn't complained. So I think there's a lot of interest out there. The partners in the eastern suburbs are actually on our grant, so Banyule and Burundurra as well. And so I think the attitudes are changing there. Biodiversity is core business for local government, and they're often doing more than state government in a lot of these areas. So, and it's because, you as residents can help change their minds, like it sounds like you have. So.
Hey, Adam, just thinking circular economy, maybe you could use recycled glass instead of sand. Some of it's a resource of video, so that we can use it here.
Yep.
But I'm sure Melbourne might have access to a fair bit more.
Yep.
Do you think recycled glass would work?
We haven't looked at that. We have done a lot of green roof research as well, and we had a look at for part of those aspects. We haven't thought about that, but there's recycled sand as well coming out of these. Repurpose It's a big recycling company in Epping. We're on the grant, and so they use recycled sand. Whether they'll use it in landscaping or not is another question, because they get a really good price for it for concrete. So, but we're also looking at crusher dust and subsoil, so basalt crush dust, subsoils, and there's a clay that is produced as part of their recycling process as well. And preliminary results are suggesting that the clay is looking pretty good. So they basically take, whenever a block's cleared or a building's cleared, everything goes to the recycling plant, and it's all separated based on metals, bricks, everything else, done on particle size, and you get sand and the clay. The subsoil is a bit more problematic in terms, because it tends to get mixed with green waste. So, but there is some opportunities there. So hopefully over the next 4 years we'll be able to look at that. I think the glass, if it got recycled as glass, is probably a better way to be going there.
Hi, Great Prezzo. Just a question about something that's followed now over the years. It's sort of prominence, I guess, and maybe to EBCs in urban environments in particular. I was involved in 1 million trees project in Western Melbourne, which is typically for grassland and or maybe urban trees and promoting that. Do you have a take on that? Or my personal opinion is something. Comment on that.
Yeah, I don't think we can be too strict, particularly in highly fragmented urban areas. Like City of Melbourne came to me early 2000s, and they there was a big furor about introducing things from Western Melbourne into Royal Park, and that was the closest things anyway. So I think we can't be too strict given how highly fragmented our landscapes are. The pollen's probably blowing around from the grasses anyway a fair bit, and we know that the genetics of the plants need to be mixed as well in a lot of cases, particularly our daisies. Really need high population numbers, and the work that John Morgan and others done around rudidosis and leucochrysum, we really need to mix those populations up anyway. So we get our plants from a number of nurseries and then grow them for seed based on that. So hopefully, but we need to do better generally, everyone, in terms of making sure the genetics are working for us. And there's projects in that with the RBG and others that we've talked about.
Hi. Thank you. Great. Another person from the Western Metro Grasslands from Pyramid.
Yep.
Great presentation. Thank you. I come from being at the Municipal Association Victoria conference yesterday, where this aspect of urban design responding to climate change is a big feature. So my question was about, like, where City of Melbourne also have a lot of work they're doing on addressing the heat, the increase in heat in the environment. Have you got some interacting studies about the impact of having these grasslands, the wildfire meadows, and how they change the heat?
No, but that is a research question that has been put forward by Catherine and others in these things. So we do irrigate, and so they will be cooler. The irrigation is there for emergencies, pretty much, and for germination, and then afterwards emergencies. But it may or may not be permanent. But they should be cooler than mown grass, which is not irrigated. But we've got colleagues at Burnley, Steve Liversley and Paul Chung, who are working in that space around how much irrigation and how much cooling can you do with irrigation with different types of vegetation types in the urban landscape. And there's a number of local governments who are interested in those questions. So not specifically with the wildflower meadows yet, but it's a potential research topic.
Just over here.
Sorry, yep.
Yeah,
Hi.
thanks for the presentation. I spotted a goat in one of your last slides.
Oh, was there a goat there?
During burning, I'm interested if you could speak a bit more to the non-traditional maintenance you're doing and how that's been received and what the cost is sort of comparatively.
Yeah, okay, so as you've probably worked out, I've sort of rushed through the end of this talk. There was another case study about using goats in Royal Park to protect white skinks habitat. Goats are really cheap, but this was around an OH&S issue. Basically, the staff couldn't get in there on what was a former rubbish tip to keep it open for the skinks, and so we trialled the goats in conjunction with City of Melbourne around that. So results still being monitored in that space. But yes, changing management is really important. I think we need to think about we're asking our urban landscapes to do a lot more. We're asking them to cool cities. We're asking them to host biodiversity. We're asking them to restore people's mental health. But we're basically just this landscape management that we're doing is what we've been doing forever, and so we need to think about more skills for that. So with the Streetscape Biodiversity Project, we had a particular species that was dying, and it was like, well, why is this one the only one that's dead? And then we realised that the contracting staff were thinking it was a weed and were spraying it with herbicide. And so it really, and then City of Melbourne changed the contracting staff, right? So it really emphasises that we need to, if we're going to get our urban landscapes to be doing more, we need to up the skill level of the maintenance, but that's difficult because all these landscape maintenance companies are having trouble finding people in the first place. So there's going to need to be some novel solutions in this space.
Thank you so much,
worries.
Professor Nick Williams.